The Prix Galien is a welcome initiative to stimulate creative research and promote excellence. Barack Obama. The Galien Awards ceremony is considered the equivalent of the Oscars night for the innovators in the labs and awards every year the best pharmaceutical product, the best biotechnology product, the best medical technology, and the best digital health product.
This is the right event, on the right issue, at the right time.
I thank His Excellency, the President, for bringing Prix Galien to Africa, and I look forward to the day when we will celebrate an African winner of the Prix Galien.
I'm particularly grateful to receive this award.
The awards are among the highest honors in science and commerce because they lead to improvement in the human condition.
The Prix Galien Awards recognize the world's brightest minds and most innovative companies. They are a true celebration of the hard work required to produce life-changing interventions.
That is what makes us optimistic about the future.
Congratulations to all of you.
Make a difference. Join the Galien Foundation. The Galien Week of Innovation has been made possible thanks to our precious friends and partners who share the Galien Foundation's values. First off, the two exclusive platinum partners are We would now like to acknowledge our two gold partners. Furthermore, we proudly introduce our corporate leaders partners. The associate partners are the grantors are To conclude, we are extremely fortunate to work with outstanding media partners who have contributed to the Galien Foundation's renown.
Hello, I'm Jessica Federer. I'm a partner at Boston Millennia and the former Chief Digital Officer for Bayer. I'd like to welcome you to this Galien Foundation Week of Innovation webinars here in New York. The objective of this week is to provide additional context and background for our largest annual event, the Prix Galien USA Awards, to be held tomorrow here in New York in conjunction with our Galien Forum of Speakers, representing the top scientific experts and leaders in global health. We've developed this new webinar series to give our nominees for Best Pharmaceutical, Best Biotech, Best MedTech, and Digital Health Product greater visibility in describing their journey of medical discovery. This year's Galien USA Awards has a record 84 nominees for the 4 categories, and these are coming from 65 companies covering 15 diverse therapeutic areas, ranging from cancer, cardiology, and neurosciences to infectious and very rare genetic diseases. We will be looking closely at the products in all these critical areas throughout the week. Now, because of the number of nominees and the range of conditions represented by all of this excellent science, the Galien USA Awards Committee has decided to host this series of 14 webinars. This is prior to the award ceremony tomorrow, where the winners in each of the 4 best of categories will be announced. In the Best Pharmaceutical Agent category, our focus today, we will be holding these 6 webinars due to the large number of products represented in this important field. There are 33. This webinar right now, in the hour we have allotted, is devoted to the nominees in rare diseases. What we will cover today relates to the central question: Will progress in therapies that promise a genetic cure for devastating rare diseases lead to similar innovations in patient access to these high-touch, high-cost treatments? Please note that the webinar will include time for audience questions, so please include your questions below and they can be forwarded to me, and I'll see them when we get to the Q&A part. Now, before moving to our discussion and introducing our panelists, let's have a quick audience poll. Can we bring up the poll, please? The poll question is, what is the most promising new medical advance likely within the next 5 to 10 years? And you have your choices below. Please take a moment and vote. All right, I hope you've had time to click on one of your answers. We'll see the answers at the end of the session. So let's move into our discussion. I'll start by introducing our nominees representatives who are joining us. Today, this is Dr. Joanne Foody, the Chief Medical Officer at Aspirion, Colin Hislop, the SVP of Clinical and Development Operations at Eiger Biopharmaceuticals, and Dr. Felina Lee, SVP of Portfolio Strategy at Blueprint Medicines. For all of you in the audience, there is an accessible link about each of the nominated products, and that is visible to you during this webcast to click on and get more details. So let's start with the first question. And the first question is, why did your company choose to focus on this specific disease state and indication? And how did this innovation from your company represent a therapeutic breakthrough? And how did that impact the significant level of unmet medical need? Dr. Foody, let's start with you.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here. You know, Aspirion has been focused as a small biotech in really bringing transformational therapies to manage lipids. And our compound here for nomination, Nexletol and Nexlizet, address very significant unmet needs for individuals at risk for cardiovascular disease or suffering from cardiovascular disease. But I think the approach from the company has always been one over the last several decades, focusing first on genetics and identifying unique patient phenotypes or genotypes to inform discovery. And this compound is no different. So Nexletol and Nexlizet address a very significant need of patients who are not achieving their LDL cholesterol reductions, or in whom available therapies don't provide them ways in which to address their risk, either because they can't tolerate them, but we believe it's an important innovation for patients.
Thank you. Dr. Lee.
Thanks, Jessica, and thank you to the Galien Foundation and the nominating committee. Very honored to be here today on behalf of Blueprint Medicines, and to have two of our therapies, Ayvakit and Gavreto, nominated amongst such an impressive record-breaking field of innovative new therapies. So thank you for that. So first off, to just introduce briefly, Blueprint Medicines is a precision therapies company, and we are really focused on identifying and targeting the genetic driver of disease in cancer and hematologic disorders. We were interested in a rare heme disorder, systemic mastocytosis, from the outset of the company's founding. And there are a couple, I think, very simple reasons for that. Systemic mastocytosis represents just substantial patient need and disease burden. And secondly, there is a known and validated driver of disease, KIT D816V, which is highly amenable to the Blueprint approach. Our approach is really focused on a novel platform that develops highly targeted, potent, and selective inhibitors of kinases, which are these disease drivers. So just to share a little bit about systemic mastocytosis and the disease, the signature of SM is having too many mast cells. These are immune cells that are part of the innate immune system and can also play a role in allergic responses. In SM, the real signature of the disease is having too many mast cells that accumulate all over the body, in the bone marrow, in the skin, in the GI tract, and they can also become activated and release mediators that lead to different debilitating symptoms for patients. From the patient's perspective, this can translate into symptoms, a range of symptoms that can include GI, brain fog, impacts on the skin with itching and swelling, and even uncontrolled bouts of anaphylaxis. We've had the opportunity to connect with a range of patients over the course of our development programs, and they talk about the challenges this poses to their work and family life, challenges holding a full-time job, challenges doing something as simple as trying to take your kids to the playground. And there are measurable real impacts on quality of life. Patients talk about the fear and isolation they can face as they're trying to avoid these unpredictable triggers of disease that sometimes the people around them and even healthcare providers don't necessarily understand. And SM, like many other rare diseases, is a spectrum. And in the most advanced cases of disease, the mast cell accumulation in organs can actually lead to failure of organs and a poor prognosis for these patients in the range of less than 6 months to 3.5 years, depending on the subtype of this advanced disease. As I said, the underlying cause is KIT D816V, and what that is it is a mutation that locks the KIT protein into the on state, so that uncontrolled signaling leads to uncontrolled growth of the mast cells that then spread throughout the body. So there really is a need to address this underlying cause with a potent and selective inhibitor, which is what we sought out to do. How is AYVAKIT a breakthrough? I think, in short, it's the first drug that achieves this profile of being a highly targeted agent against KIT D816V. And it is actually the first drug to show patient impact and benefit across that full spectrum of disease. In fact, it also was the first drug to show benefit in a rare subset of a GI tumor called gastrointestinal stromal tumor. And it's a subset of these patients, this is going to be a mouthful, with a PDGFR alpha D842V mutation, which happens to be the sister mutation structurally of KIT D816V. And so in this subset, we have shown a nearly 90% overall response rate. This is also a subset of patients who had no treatment options. And we've been fortunate to have been granted 3 breakthrough therapy designations from the FDA for AYVAKIT across this rare GIST subset and both advanced and non-advanced systemic mastocytosis.
Thank you, Felina. Colin?
Also, to echo my colleagues, I would like to thank you, Jessica, for the opportunity to present here, as well as to the nominating committee for the honor that they've bestowed on Iger and the team that led the development, if you like, or the prosecution of the most recent regulatory filing for Zokinvy, which is actually a relatively old drug, lonafarnib, a farnesyl transferase inhibitor. The disease that we're talking about is commonly referred to as progeria. It is actually Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome, a disease that was first identified in the late 1800s, but it wasn't until the early 2000s that the genetic basis for this disease was actually identified, and it is due to a spontaneous genetic mutation in the parent. So there's no way of really detecting this disease, and whether or not ultimately it would be familial is unknown at this point in time, because unfortunately the disease is almost universally fatal in the mid-teen years for the children that are affected. The disease is the result of, as I said, of a genetic mutation that leads to the formation or the coding of an abnormal protein that becomes permanently farnesylated. This particular protein, lamin A, plays important roles in the maintenance of the nuclear envelope, the nuclear structure, as well as maintenance of chromatin and roles during cellular division. And abnormalities, the permanent farnesylation of this abnormal protein really means that a lot of that functional activity is lost. And as a consequence, these children very early on in life begin to exhibit the characteristics of the disease, the phenotypical characteristics. They show failure to thrive. Ultimately, their growth is very linear, but very slow. They will reach an adult height, often maybe a meter and a half, and certainly won't be particularly heavy. They don't gain weight very much at all, probably 20 kilograms or thereabouts at their fully grown adult size. But the most devastating consequence of this disease is a very accelerated, very aggressive form of cardiovascular disease, arteriosclerosis and atherosclerosis. And unfortunately, these children untreated would succumb to the consequences of cardiovascular disease, be that heart failure, be that stroke, usually in their mid-teen years. Now, having identified the genetic defect and the role of farnesylation and permanent farnesylation in the development of the clinical condition, a number of interventions were sought. One of the most logical was a farnesyl transferase inhibitor, which is what Eiger's compound is. And indeed, this was the first candidate, and so far the only clinical candidate that has gone forward in clinical study and reached the stage of approval. One of the challenges here is the rarity of this disease. It's probably of the order of 1 in 8 million or greater, or fewer, I should say, live births. So the total number of affected patients throughout the world is probably of the order of 300 to 400 max, of which probably 130 or so are already identified or have been identified. And most of those children that were living with the disease have been included in the clinical studies that were conducted and that we prosecuted the NDA based on those data. At the same time, Eiger is also a company focused in rare and orphan diseases, and it just so happens that farnesylation also plays a key role in the life cycle of hepatitis D virus. And so lonafarnib, in combination with ritonavir, is currently being developed for hepatitis delta virus as a treatment alternative, as I say, because it plays such a prominent role, or farnesylation plays such a prominent role in the life cycle of that disease. So that's how the two different diseases come together in terms of the commonality being the mechanism-based approach. And in terms of the impact, these children, as I said, commonly die around the age of 14 and a half years to 15 years on average due to cardiovascular disease. We've seen with the longitudinal data now that's been produced from clinical studies over many years, almost approaching 10, 11 years of follow-up, that the average increase in survival is now exceeding 4.5 years. So we've gone from a situation prior to the first clinical studies being initiated in 2007, where survival was really somewhere in the range of 14, 15, 16 years or thereabouts, to an average increase now, which takes it to the late teens and 20s. And indeed, there are many children now that have actually gone through their teen years, entered their early adult life. And in fact, one of the oldest is a 25-year-old young man in Italy who's just completed his postgraduate education. So from the point of view of the impact on these children and the disease, it's the increase in longevity, which I think has really carried the day.
Thank you, Colin, for that background and for the work that all of your companies are doing in these areas. The second question is about, the impact on clinical outcomes. And Colin, you just addressed this very nicely. But the question is about clinical outcomes for patients. And then also the second part of that is, what's the clinician response been so far? Philina, could you start for us?
Thanks, Jessica. The clinical impact of AYVAKIT has been very important, and we're just at the very first stages of this journey as well. What we have demonstrated so far in the advanced subset of the disease is very rapid and deep and durable responses in the majority of patients with advanced SM. About 3/4 of these patients are responding. They are responding in as quickly as 2 months. And these responses are very deep, including complete responses where you no longer see mast cells in the bone marrow. We're also really encouraged to see the durability of these responses, which so far have been on the order of longer than 3 years. From a survival perspective, I talked about how the disease can lead to a poor prognosis. So far, the median overall survival is not yet reached. And this is particularly important in a subset of these patients who have mast cell leukemia and normally have a prognosis of less than 6 months. So we're continuing to track and study on that. I think what helps bring these numbers to life for me personally is to hear stories from individuals who have benefited from treatment. To share one of those that I had the privilege to hear recently, there was a patient who had participated in the clinical trials of avapritinib. His journey, he had been living with advanced SM. His health status had been declining. He was faced with significant anemia, substantial weight loss. He lost 40 pounds in a number of months. And he was really struggling to continue to work, and just with the extreme fatigue that all of this was causing for him. Treated by his local doctor, he received chemotherapy, which wasn't able to control the disease, and he was told there were no options left for him. And now, fortunately, this patient found his way to an expert in systemic mastocytosis and was able to start on the clinical trial of avapritinib, and was able to benefit from that study. And so, he tells stories of, he's put back on the weight, he's doing well at work, he's even able to run and do sports, which is something he wasn't able to do for years. And he's at this point been on the trial for over 3 years. And so, that's one patient example, but I think that's really what we're striving for in this work that we're collectively doing, is this kind of impact on patient outcomes. Now, the second part of your question, I think, was about what has the clinician response been. And so with AYVAKIT now registered, we've been very encouraged to see just the breadth of interest in AYVAKIT, that we're seeing this across centers of excellence, as well as in community practices, that there is a desire to treat patients who have not benefited from prior therapies or been refractory, but also to treat patients who are treatment naive and earlier on in their patient journey. And I think this really speaks to the degree of need in the disease. In fact, when we talk to some of the experts and investigators who have been involved in the study, they talk about, one of them used the term, we've been waiting a long time for a magic bullet against systemic mastocytosis, and that therapies like avapritinib are really fulfilling that long-term need by targeting the underlying cause of the disease in such a highly selective way.
Thank you, Philina. Colin, can you share with us a little bit about the clinician response that you've seen?
Well, the clinician response actually in this instance is somewhat unique, because the clinical studies were all conducted, or all three of them were conducted at Boston Children's Hospital. And because of the rarity of this condition, the children generally get referred to centers of excellence like Boston Children's. So, and because of the complexity of the disease as well, the follow-up tends to cross a number of different specialities. Obviously, there is cardiology, but in addition, some of these children do develop contractures and joint issues as well. So it's a multidisciplinary type of management structure that these children are involved in. And often they will have a primary care physician in their hometown or in their home country, but the care will primarily be provided in terms of disease management at a center like Boston Children's Hospital. So we haven't had a lot of that physician feedback per se that you might expect with other diseases. But of course, the people at Boston Children's Hospital very familiar with the data and are very supportive. What I will say, though, in part and in answer to your question, is that the data themselves have been very, very well received through the managed care organizations. And there hasn't really been any hesitancy or pushback in terms of the value of this therapy to the patient, as well as the strength of the data that I can speak to in a few moments, and I will do as part of the answer to question 3, the data that underpins the survival benefit. So whilst I can't speak to a number of different physicians providing feedback, I think I can say that in the 1 or 2 instances where we've spoken to physicians, they've embraced the data and the potential value and benefit for their patients. But as I say, in a broader canvas amongst the healthcare management organizations, again, there's been a great deal of positivity and feedback.
Glad to hear it. Thank you. Joanne.
Yeah, so Jessica, thank you. I think in counter distinction to my other colleagues, here at Aspirion, we're a small biotech, really not tackling a rare disease. And, our biggest priority is tackling cardiovascular disease, the #1 killer worldwide, through modification of cholesterol. And so, one of our challenges is with our compounds Nexletol and Nexlizet, that we have a very significant reduction in LDL that's been demonstrated in a large phase 3 clinical program, and bringing benefits already with the approvals to patients globally. And I think, though, that the bar in cardiovascular therapeutics in the large space, in the non-rare disease space, is different, right? So given the exigencies of our regulators, we are required to do large outcomes trials to truly demonstrate the overall benefit of these compounds. So at present, we're conducting clear outcomes, really what hopefully will be a transformational study for patients, targeting over 14,000 patients with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease in whom they can't tolerate a statin. I think everyone thinks that statins have solved the problem for cholesterol lowering, and they haven't. We still know today that 50% of individuals at high risk for events or with cardiovascular disease do not have their LDL appropriately addressed. So our study actually addresses that, again, in 14,000 individuals. And our hope is that this will bring further demonstration that therapies that address the LDL pathway will improve outcomes. But I think, perhaps the reason that we're here in this session is that much of the underpinning of what we've done as a company is going back to the basics of genetic signals that we've seen, either phenotypes. For example, if it's our pipeline compound, our oral PCSK9, these discoveries were built on genetic understandings of Helen Hobbs and in small groups of patients that had exquisitely high LDL cholesterols and dramatic cardiovascular risk. So I think we're applying the lessons learned from these genetic therapies to ensure that we can then bring therapeutic advantage not to rare diseases, but really now extend them to very globally significant diseases that affect millions. And so we're really proud of what we've been able to do in leveraging that. I think as far as how have providers looked at our therapeutics, most clinicians, and I speak as a preventive cardiologist with decades of trying to reduce risk for patients with heart disease, clinicians and patients alike are frustrated with the lack of oral options that they have. And so clinicians and patients are quite pleased. And Felina shared a story. As much as, you know, we try to get to people before they're symptomatic with their disease, patients suffer with myalgias, for example, with statins, and are unable to have a good quality of life. We have many, many patients who, for the first time, can actually get their LDL cholesterol to a range that's acceptable to them and to their providers, and can do that without impacting their ability to walk or do the things they enjoy, like playing tennis or playing golf. So we're happy. We do have challenges, and I think that we'll discuss that subsequently. The COVID pandemic, I think, has made any commercial launch a huge challenge in trying to bring these therapies to the right patient at the right time in the current environment.
And that's the segue to the next question on challenges. And one of the reasons we're all here today is to share some lessons learned from those challenges that might add to a better public understanding, a better awareness of the innovative process that you had to go through. Colin, could you start for us?
I would be happy.
Oh, I think
the field of progeria is. Are you able to hear? I thought. Sorry,
You're good now. Please proceed. Thank you.
Okay, the video's not starting though for some reason.
That's all right.
But I'm sure you don't need to see me anyway. So the genetic basis of this disease, as I mentioned, was only identified in around 2003. And so, as with the understanding of the disease and potential interventions from a clinical perspective, models have evolved in a relatively short time frame as well. The issue, quite honestly, with these models is that each of them has their own limitations, and there are species variations, and none of them truly represent the human condition. So, for example, there is a model that has all the characteristics of the cardiovascular disease that I spoke to, but none of the other phenotypic elements that are associated with the human condition. And then conversely, there are models in which the cardiovascular disease can only be manifest over the background of an ApoE double knockout, for example, you know, sort of a classic cardiovascular model. So the long and the short of it is that there is no foundational or standard model that one could actually look at and apply to new therapeutics. So that was one of the challenges. But having said that, the fact that the fundamental genetic defect behind the disease results in an abnormal protein, and that protein can be measured, gives us a potential clinical biomarker that is probably more relevant. And what we have seen in the clinical data is that this particular biomarker, progerin, which is extraordinarily toxic to particularly vascular smooth muscle cells and accumulates in both large and small vessels, causes a gross inflammatory response with a lot of fibrous matrix deposition, is very, very measurable. And in the clinical data, we've been able to demonstrate almost a dose-dependent decrease in the biomarker that appears to correlate with improvements in vascular function, things like carotid echo density decreasing, pulse wave velocity decreasing, and ultimately we have seen rather than having development of cardiovascular morbidity, hypertension, and then going on to develop heart failure, for example, the progerin reduction, improvements in vascular function have translated into a very stable cardiovascular system in which the children do not develop hypertension. And that probably is underpinning, from a pharmacologic and biologic plausibility perspective, the increase in survival that I mentioned of about 4.5 years or so that we're seeing now currently. So that was a rather convoluted answer to your question. The long and the short of it is there are a number of different models. There are some in vitro studies that can be done, but the in vivo models are far from perfect. There is no one model that actually displays the true human condition.
Thank you, Colin. Joanne, can you tell us about some of the lessons you learned?
Yeah, so again, I think the challenges for us slightly different. If we look at what's gone on over the last 2 years, we had the unfortunate opportunity to launch our compounds Nexletol and Nexlizet during the pandemic. And I think what has been a challenge is that, you know, in general, the world has taken its focus off of preventive therapies, whether it be patients or providers. And I think it's been also just a very challenging time for access. So a lot of what we're doing to try to combat this, whether it's been in regards to running a clinical trial of the size of ours globally, is put in place a variety of mitigation strategies, including digital and virtual technologies to support patients and providers, as well as PIs for these studies. But also, you know, how do we ensure that the right information is getting out regarding our compounds, regarding the science, regarding the data to providers globally in an environment where we really don't have access. So we've moved to a more data science analytic approach to think differently about doing that and how we can really try to move the field forward while helping providers and patients understand the importance of preventive therapies and the need to really get back to basics during these challenging times of the pandemic.
Galien, can you tell us about some of the lessons learned?
Absolutely. I concur with the challenges Colin and Joanne shared. So I'll highlight maybe two other specific challenges and some lessons learned on how to address them. So, you know, the first is at the outset of our development program with systemic mastocytosis, there were no approved therapies. And so there's really no roadmap for how you develop a drug for this rare condition. I think that's a common theme. And so when I think about what did we learn in terms of how to go about that, from a team perspective, I think there's just an element of innate optimism and being scrappy and getting creative, enriching for those types of phenotypes. And then I think from a more sort of concrete, you know, learnings perspective, you know, the first is just early and active engagement with the thought leader community. And, you know, we partnered with experts in SM early on and continue to do so. And through those interactions, we have been able to implement, you know, the most current types of response criteria for the disease. And we continue to focus on innovating these types of endpoints so that we can really measure impact on disease burden and really help, you know, further the field of the next therapies and advances that will be coming, and to really hone response criteria that are also more relevant to the broad group of patients with SM. You know, a second piece is then on the patient perspective, partnering with advocacy and patient communities, also early and active engagement. And through doing that, we've been able to do things like develop novel patient-reported outcomes tools that are also used as endpoints in our studies. And there we can now objectively measure the impact on symptom burden of treatments like AYVAKIT and what we'll be developing next. You know, a third piece, just from a company perspective, is you know, and I've been at Blueprint for 7 years. We've been in operations for 10 years. And so we've been building the company at the same time as we've been developing these therapies. And that in itself poses its own, I think, unique challenges for a young biopharma company. And I think there are just elements of agility that are very important. You know, AYVAKIT was being developed for a broader subset of GI stromal tumor patients. The development pathway there didn't ultimately pan out to the full potential that we had hoped for. But at the same time, we saw more and more encouraging data building on the systemic mastocytosis side. And that enabled us to redouble our efforts on systemic mastocytosis. And so that agility, that ability to follow the science, you know, we've already heard other examples of where a therapeutic approach, if it works somewhere, it may likely work importantly somewhere else as well. And so having that agility is important. The last thing I'll say is, going back to that company build notion, there's also this challenge and opportunity of rapid paths for development. And so, you know, at Blueprint, the multiple therapies we have registered to date have all been approved from first in human to registration between 3 to 5 years. So, you know, these are among the fastest development paths in the industry, something we're very proud of, and that stems from that science-based approach. And secondly, then, that poses challenges of standing up organizations to deliver on the promise of these therapies. And I'd say, you know, currently, very proud to say we have infrastructure in the United States and in Europe to be able to deliver on therapies. We have global partnerships to enable broader impact on patients globally as well. And we continue to fuel our research engine to develop those next therapies to come in the portfolio.
Thank you, Felina. Now, before we get to our last question for the panelists, I do want to ask that we bring up the answers from the poll question so we can see how the audience voted on the poll. All right, so it looks like around 38% of our participants voted that the most promising new medical advance in the next 5 to 10 years is around solving the blood-brain barriers and leading to advances against neurological disorders, including hopefully clinically effective treatments for AZ. And then coming behind that at 25% was the further refinement of safe and clinically effective CAR-T and other cell and gene therapies. So after hearing from our audience, I want to turn the question back to our panelists. You know, we're here today to lead up to the awards that are being given tomorrow in these incredible scientific advancements and the hard work in building the companies and building the innovations that your teams have done. But asking you to look forward and tell us, as experts in the field who've devoted your entire lives to this scientific advancement of new therapies and new treatments, and you put your energy and sacrifice time with your family, and this has really been a priority for you. What is it that you're most excited about? And what do you hope we will be giving awards to 5 years from now? Joanne, could you start for us?
So Jessica, thank you. You know, and I'm biased here. I'm a preventive cardiologist and have spent most of my time trying to see how we can prevent disease, right? And I still firmly believe that the innovations of the future will be a combination of all the insights that we have from current drug development, but coupled with data, with analytics, with artificial intelligence to really bring us a true precision or personalized medicine approach. I think these are ultimately either drug device or drug technology combinations that can hopefully identify people either genotypically or phenotypically before they have disease. I really fundamentally believe that it is a shame in this day and age, given all the technology, resources, everything we have, that we wait until people are dying to intervene. And I believe that as an industry, as a society, that we should push for primordial prevention and put resources into that. I think currently our incentives in many countries, including the US, are misaligned with respect to the investments in those places. And I firmly also believe that the regulatory path should be modified in a way that you could bring preventive therapies forward in novel ways to address these conditions. So that's really where I stand relative to where I would like to see a future.
I'd like to see that future too. Felina.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe starting from the perspective of SM and then going more broadly, I think, more immediately in front of us, we're excited to advance the development of avapritinib to a broader group of patients with systemic mastocytosis. We have embarked on a robust registrational randomized controlled study in the non-advanced subset of patients. And secondly, we're also developing a next generation therapy called BLU-263, which has an enhanced profile. And we believe that there's potential to impact and benefit a broader group of patients with systemic mastocytosis, as well as monoclonal mast cell activation syndrome. So a broader group of patients with these types of mast cell disorders. I think going more broadly beyond that and looking across the field, and Joanne's comment on just really timely intervention resonates very, very strongly. We foresee that there will be more and more of these precision therapies, a broadening armamentarium. But secondly, it makes the implementation of these therapies so much more important. And that's where I think we can take learnings from precision oncology, where the availability of a range of therapies is a really strong impetus for disease awareness and timely biomarker testing and really how to action on these therapies. And so I'm really excited for a suite of technologies focused around that implementation, new and better non-invasive biomarker screening technologies, the implementation of diagnostic testing algorithms in health systems, and really leveraging clinical decision support tools so that clinicians don't have to remember all of this information at top of mind, but they can get just in time triggered information on when to test and what to do based on the results of that test. And maybe the last thing I'll say as a call to action to our audience is really that continued need for collaboration across this ecosystem that we're working within, that between industry, as we develop the next range of innovations, with healthcare providers, multidisciplinary care teams, patient advocacy groups, laboratory, reference labs. We need to really come together as one unit and be striving to really develop and implement so that patients can realize the benefit.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you. Colin, what do you see ahead?
I'm actually going to build on the point that Felina just made and Joanne made earlier as well. Certainly, the collaboration between the pharmaceutical companies, perhaps the therapeutic innovators, patient advocacy groups, and the delivery of clinical care is, I think, exemplified in the example that we're talking about, we being Eiger and Progeria, where we have collaborated very successfully with the Progeria Research Foundation, not only in terms of their patient advocacy, but their support also of the clinical trials in conjunction with Boston Children's Hospital. And I would certainly echo Felina's sentiments there. Looking forward, Eiger is a company that is focused on orphan diseases. The lead compounds in phase 3 are aimed at treating hepatitis delta virus infection, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. This is a disease in which they have various benefits comparing one to another, whether that's in terms of efficacy or that's in terms of the safety profile. But at the end of the day, to Joanna's point, it's going to be a database decision as to how these drugs are used, and they are going to be used in combination. And so looking ahead, based on recent approvals to come, hopefully in the relatively near future, I think we're going to see the evolution of a number of different therapeutic strategies that are multidimensional, have different therapeutics, different mechanisms of action that ultimately I think will give the clinicians the best tools to treat the disease as successfully as possible. And then the third point that I'd like to make does go back to progeria, and again builds on something that Joanne was saying, and that is the timeliness of intervention and not waiting until patients are a long way through their lifespan or have emergent clinical disease. Progeria is actually a microcosm of the aging process. The cardiovascular disease is an accelerated form of what we all go through. And again, in conjunction with groups like the Progeria Research Foundation and collaboration with pharmaceutical companies, I think there's a tremendous opportunity there that's just beginning to be exploited in terms of taking the understandings of how therapeutics may modify the disease process in progeria, how that relates to the natural aging process, and what, if any, clinical interventions might there be in terms of being able to head off. I don't think we're going to ever become immortal. That's not what I'm saying, but being able to head off the development of some of these very significant, on a global health care perspective, some of these very significant forms of cardiovascular disease with their associated morbidity and mortality. So somewhere in that constellation of remarks, I hope is what we will be talking about in 3 to 5 years' time.
Thank you, Colin. And as a former CDO of a pharma company and now an investor in innovation companies, I think I want to echo a lot of the thoughts that you've said around the move towards a learning healthcare system, where all the parts work together and we don't have so many silos of information. And, the learning healthcare system is a concept we've had for a while, but we're finally addressing some of the hurdles in interoperability that are allowing us to see in near real time an integrated data picture of one of our patients or study participants. And that will soon be able to help us inform better care and faster research and more real-world data studies with synthetic control arms and more hybrid trials. And that will continue to advance the field that we're in. So I'm going to go around for a very brief final comment from everyone before we close the session. But first, I want to thank you and your companies and your teams and your colleagues and your investors and your entire community, and specifically the trial participants and their families for the time and energy and trust that they have put into science and participating in the studies that you all have led and have been innovating in. So just brief final thoughts. Joanne, can you start for us?
So Jessica, thank you again. Thank you for the opportunity. And on behalf of Aspirion, on behalf of our shareholders, but most importantly, our employees and our patients enrolled, we want to thank you and for this opportunity as we bring innovative therapies to manage cholesterol.
Thank you, Joanne. Felina.
Yes, thank you to you and my co-panelists and the Galien Foundation for this opportunity. I'll just put a cap on my statement about collaboration and its importance. These long-term partnerships are absolutely critical. We don't wade into this space lightly, but we see this as a very long-term and ongoing partnership. We are highly honored and privileged to be able to work with disease experts, patient advocates, and patients themselves to learn from them and continually learn and improve and fuel our serial innovation, both in systemic mastocytosis and more broadly across precision oncology and heme disorders. We're on a mission, we're here to stay, and we're honored and privileged to be part of the advancement.
Thank you, Felina. Colin.
I would also like to express my thanks once again to the foundation for the nomination, but also for the opportunity to participate this afternoon, and thank everybody involved, my fellow panelists as well, on behalf of not only myself, but all the employees at IGER. And I would also like to echo Felina and Joanne's sentiments in terms of appreciation for the collaboration that we've had with the Progeria Research Foundation, with the clinical team at Boston Children's Hospital, but also for the opportunity to actually interact with some of these patients. And I mentioned earlier that there's a young man in Italy, delightful individual, who is now 25 years of age and pursuing his postgraduate studies. And it's the opportunity to interact with patients on a very personal and human level, which I think resonates significantly with me. So it's a thank you, as you articulated, Jessica, to all of the parents of these children and the patients themselves as well. It's been a real privilege.
Thank you, Colin. So now it's my pleasure to thank each of you one more time and your companies. And I also want to remind everyone that this webcast will be viewable on the Galien Foundation's homepage. And you will be able to also join us for the forum tomorrow, which is available online, and the evening pre-Galien Awards with the presentation of the 2021 Roy Vagelos Pro Bono Humanitarian Award winner, which will be given jointly to the CEOs of the companies that led this year's unprecedented early arrival of vaccines and therapeutics to fight COVID-19. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.